Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our session on creating resilient supply chains in the face of climate change. I'm Christy Melhart-Slay, the Senior Director for Science and Research Applications at the Sustainability Consortium. Today, we're going to be speaking about an overview of a report that the Sustainability Consortium co-published with HSBC Bank, giving an overview of how companies can improve supply chain resilience to manage climate change risks. This will be an introduction to resiliency in supply chains and climate change risks that companies are facing globally. And then we'll move on to our panel perspectives on climate change and climate risks and hear from some guest panelists that we've gathered here today. The purpose of the report was to help companies understand why climate change risks should be addressed within a supply chain risk management program and discuss how companies can create greater supply chain resilience. And when we published the report, we certainly didn't know that COVID-19 was on the way and coincided with our publishing of the report. And so many of the examples and the frameworks and the really lessons learned from historic events apply not only to climate change, but also to disruptions such as COVID-19. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to my co-author of the report, Kevin Dooley, who is our chief scientist at the Sustainability Consortium and also professor of supply chain management at Arizona State University. Hi, Kevin, welcome.
Christy. So we're talking about disruption of a value chain within the delivery of products or services to end consumers. And because modern supply chains or supply networks are so incredibly complex and so global, they face a large exposure to all sorts of different risks that can impact natural, economic, physical, or social systems that constitute their operational capability. And in looking at climate change, we want to distinguish the type of events that, in fact, we're seeing right now with the wildfires, with the hurricanes hitting the U.S. coast. And these are extreme weather events or one-time disruptions that may be short-lived or may have very long-term consequences. However, what is different, will be different in the future from the past is that we will also see significant chronic long-term disruptions, especially to natural systems that we will have to adapt for. From a supply chain management perspective, there are different potential outcomes of a supply chain disruption. It can increase the cost of supply. It can make it so that you have to accept supply that is lower quality, or you may even need to turn to a different supplier or supply chain in order to get alternative supply. And as we've all, I'm sure, experienced ourselves during the pandemic, there's delayed delivery of supply. So we may or may not want to buy 10 rolls of toilet paper at once, but if the store says no, you can only have one packet, then we have to delay that satisfaction of that demand. Next, please. So what is different about climate change now and into the future? Well, we'll see disruptions that are more significant in their impact, that last longer, and that have more frequent occurrence. We'll see supply chain disruptions in more places, both at once and overall. So, for example, places that are now low or medium risk for storm surge, are likely to change to higher risk due to sea level change. Especially in agriculture and forestry, because of changing growing regions, we'll see structural transitions as growing regions move from one area to another. Because of the increased tangible effects of climate change, we think that there will be increased interest of all stakeholders on decarbonization and in particular the investment world, we've already seen those signals, and we expect that as carbon taxes become more common, that this focus on supply chain decarbonization will be one of the key differentiators of those firms that do well and don't. And finally, climate change is challenging our definition of force majeure in buyer-supplier contracts, as one must question whether extreme weather events, for example, are really unforeseeable or not. And those challenges will go on in the courts over the next decade. There on the right, you see a picture of fisheries, global fisheries, and those those shown in the pink are fisheries that are expected to see significant decreases in yield by 2050. Next. So resilience from the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. I love this definition. Let me just kind of emphasize the verbs here, right? We want to address hazards by resisting them, absorbing them, accommodating them, adapting to them, transforming, and recovering from them. And so it really is all the different tools that we have in our risk management toolkit, whether it's to avoid the hazard all the way to recognizing that the hazard may take place and what we will do when that happens to accommodate or adapt to it. Next. So the world of supply chain management has practiced or has experienced many different experiments and best practices to see how to best adapt to supply chain disruptions. They generally fall into these two categories of bridging and buffering. And their overall message is that you should bridge when you can, but buffer just in case. So bridging is about creating a deeper connection, a deeper relationship between buyer and supplier. At a very tangible kind of information level, it's about connecting our information systems that largely do the ordering and demand forecasting that determine whether or not we have enough supply to meet demand. But at a more company to company and interpersonal level, it's about developing the social capital and relationship to both understand where your suppliers are and then potentially to help steer them towards help, whether it be in terms of supply chain financing or helping them understand adoption of new technologies and best practices. And, you know, when your supplier, let's say, is disrupted and gets back to 25% or 50% capacity, you want to be the customer who they service first, right? And that means having a strong relationship with them. Now, of course, there are things out of everyone's control that lead to disruptions that we have to kind of buy insurance for. So we might pile up inventory, and it might not make sense to pile up, let's say, paper towel inventory, but it might make sense to pile up certain medical supply inventory, right? So, you know, inventory buffers, capacity, as we've seen textile mills change to manufacture medical textiles, it shows the flexibility of our capacity there in manufacturing. Or we can simply say, you know, you'll get it, but you're not going to get it in the same time frame that you expect. And of course, sometimes that's buffered itself by paying extra for expedited supply. Next, please. So, Christy, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Kevin, for that wonderful overview and introduction to supply chains and supply chain disruption due to climate change and different strategies that companies can use to mitigate impacts and plan ahead for impacts that we know will continue to happen. And so I want to switch to our panel discussion. And so we're going to gain perspectives on this topic with Kevin and also Maria Lettini, the Executive Director of the FAIRR Initiative. Hi, Maria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Christy. My name is Maria Lettini, as Christy mentioned. I run the FAIRR Initiative. which is a global institutional investor network. We produce research and practical tools for investors to help them assess global supply chain risk. And we look specifically in the food system and at protein. So again, fantastic discussion because we did see some supply chain risk rather recently with COVID. I also mentioned that I sit on the steering committee of the Intentional Endowment Network, which is a partner with Second Nature. And they've partnered with the Higher Education Leadership Summit, of which has been a couple times at ASU. So excited to be on the panel and contributing to the discussion.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for being here. And next we have Stewart Lindsay, the head of corporate engagement in agriculture and food for the Nature Conservancy. Hi, Stewart. Would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thanks. Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here. I, as stated, work on our corporate engagement team at the Nature Conservancy, and we're a team that works hand in hand with companies to operationalize nature-based solutions in their business, enhance the sustainability and resilience of their operations, and generate co-benefits for all of us.
Great. Thank you, Stewart. So glad to have you both here. We'll kick off our panel discussion with a question for Kevin. Given the uncertainty of COVID and climate impacts, what are some of the ways that companies can improve supply chain resiliency against these disruptions? So maybe some good examples that you found.
Sure. So I think we've all read in the newspaper about the paper shortages that we have had, and there's been some accounts that say, well, it's because of lean manufacturing attitudes, and we've gone too lean and we don't have enough inventory. And I'm not sure I agree with that argument, because we had about 3 to 4 weeks of inventory in the US supply chain for paper products, which is probably about as much as we should ever expect. And there's not really any reason to think that we need to have 6 months of paper supplies in warehouses. On the other hand, what we did see was the result of very, very fine supply chain management gone too far, or let's say not considering the broader system aspects. So we have optimized our paper supply chain so much to 2 different channels, the consumer market and the business market with restaurants and hotels and whatnot. We've optimized those supply chains so much that we didn't have the ability to switch the supply in one channel to another, which is why, you could get paper towels that were packaged like they were being sent to a restaurant, for your home use if you wanted, because that's what was available. And I think that into the future, I think that we'll see that we will invest as a society and economy in creating buffers, whether they be in terms of inventory or in terms of capacity, for certain critical supply chains. So I think food and medical supplies in particular actually need to be prioritized. And historically, we haven't been allowed to talk about that. We have to say, oh no, all consumer goods are the same, all supply chains are equal, but that's not the case. And so I think we'll see kind of a societal prioritization on making certain supply chains much more resilient.
Thank you. Excellent comments. And so the next question is for Stewart. The Nature Conservancy was recently awarded $10 million in funding from Amazon to restore and conserve 4 million acres of forest in the US. The main purpose of this funding was to create a network of climate resilient forests. Tell us more about this program and the ways the Nature Conservancy is focusing on resilient supply chains and nature-based solutions to the climate challenge.
I'm happy to. Thanks for the question. Ultimately, the work we do in partnerships with companies is about unlocking the full potential of nature. And in our view, and the science backs this up, there's a huge potential there, and it's quite frankly underutilized at the moment. So when we think about this, and especially in the case of supply chains and operations, we think on 2 levels. Are companies really thinking about how to integrate nature into their operations from a P&L standpoint, from a logistics standpoint, and from a supply chain standpoint? And the second question would be, how can we work with companies, and how are companies contributing to unlocking the big potential, which is creating the frameworks and the market systems that could reprice ecosystem services, where we'll really get the most efficient way to become more resilient and mitigate climate change and improve environmental performance overall. So let me give you one quick example, and then I'll come back to the Amazon question. Ag is probably a place where this holds the truest. Ag is entirely reliant on nature for its productivity. It needs good soils, needs clean water, it needs appropriate climatic conditions. And if you think about the beef sector in the U.S., that's really, the numbers are pretty stark. 775 million acres of grazing land, about 30 million acres of cropland that goes into feed. This is a massive environmental system. So we've been working with companies like Walmart, McDonald's, and others to look at the entire beef system and figure out at each step of the process, what are some of the environmental practices, production practices that could have the best environmental benefit and could be economically rational at the same time. And we put that out on a beef roadmap. And if you look at across that and you see different ways that you can work with ranchers, work with farmers, work with producers, you can see how an agricultural system, by having very fine-tuned interventions at different places that make sense for operations, that make sense for producers, you can have a more environmentally optimal system. And a more environmentally optimal ag supply chain is ultimately a more resilient supply chain. So we're really excited about doing that kind of hands-on work with companies. Now, back to the Amazon question. The work we're doing with them and with their Right Now Climate Fund really holds the potential to help unlock the big picture, let's say, about a repricing of environmental assets. Carbon is obviously the key one. Our science shows that natural climate solutions could get us about a third of the way to the 2-degree pathway that has been determined to be essential moving forward. So about 11 gigatons of potential CO2 mitigation from natural climate solutions, which is, land conservation, land management, land restoration. So the cool thing about this Amazon investment, and it's into some programs that we're standing up in the Eastern United States, is that it enables smaller landowners, small timber owners, people with maybe 100, 200, 300 acres of timber to enter the carbon markets. It reduces the barrier to entry, makes it more efficient. Now you think, well, what's the point of that? Well, the point of that is that small and mid-sized landowners own about 40% of the timber in the United States. So if you think about a well-functioning market for carbon, a market that unlocks mitigation potential around the world, that makes it more economically efficient, that's a huge supply. Markets need good supply. And these are the kind of steps that we can take with companies. These are the kind of steps companies can take themselves to enhance resilience overall using nature. So we're really excited about it.
Thank you, Stewart. That is such a great overview of the work you're doing at the Nature Conservancy, and certainly sets up the mechanism by which we can meet the demand that Kevin described, and the reprioritization that he described on food, for the future. And so really appreciate those comments. Next up, Maria. The global beef and poultry and pork supply chains are the second largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and are the leading cause of deforestation and biodiversity loss globally. FAIRR is focused on these supply chains through its collaborative investor network. How does FAIRR work with investors to integrate these environmental, social, and governance risks into decision making?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and it's a nice seg straight after Stewart's comments, because you're absolutely right. Institutional investors are also grappling with the risks associated with agriculture and animal agriculture and what that means to long-term value of investment portfolios. And so that's really where FAIRR has tried to find its sweet spot. We felt that there was a real lack of information and data. Obviously, the market's moved quite a bit on that. And so what we've done is we really focus on two sort of streams of work. One is, how can we produce investor tools that will allow analysts and portfolio managers to take qualitative and quantitative information and integrate that into its portfolio management process. And then we also look at thematic work. So things like deforestation. We look at aquaculture, for example. We look at biodiversity loss. We think about sustainable protein and all from a perspective of how does that relate to making more sustainable global protein supply chains, whether it be making those animal proteins more sustainable or actually focusing in on more alternative, more sustainable protein products that are non-animal products. And so kind of to build off of what Stewart said in terms of products, and it actually segs quite nicely, and maybe I wasn't so familiar with it before, but something we did this year was embark on a project called the Climate Risk Tool. And again, it's for institutional investors, and we actually have some university courses whose students are using our tool to do some of their own research. But what it does, it looks at the 40 largest listed global meat producers and does some climate scenario analysis. So we look at these 40 companies and we see how those companies' earnings will be impacted out through 2050 in a 2-degree climate scenario. And these companies obviously are in different jurisdictions. They operate in different regions of the world. They have different focuses on proteins. And we know that when we think about what's going to happen over the next 30 years, they are going to be bombarded with a lot of, pretty key climate risks. And we wanted to give investors a tool to understand how those companies might respond over the next 30 years. And, some of the key things are those which have already been mentioned, right? One is how will these companies look to mitigate impacts on animal protein through innovation and adaptation, much as what we've already mentioned, whether it be with feed processing, additives, anaerobic digestion, things that we know that are happening now, and how will that develop, and how will companies begin to really focus their attention on making their supply chains more sustainable in that way. But also, how will they be responding to a carbon tax that could possibly come into the market? How is that going to affect their energy prices, their animal feed costs, their mortality rate as we see more heat days? And then really looking at how these companies are embracing the move into alternative proteins, so away from animal protein. And, I think this is a really fantastic example of how FAIRR can provide tools for investors to better understand the risks associated with the sector and to help in their dialogue with these companies to say, hey, what are you doing to mitigate these risks? And how can we help you understand a trajectory that will make not only your profits safeguarded against what we know is almost inevitable at this point, at least a 2-degree scenario, and how can that safeguard our own investment portfolios? And working together in that process, I think, helps complement the work that everyone else is doing in the climate stage.
Thank you, Maria. I think it's fascinating to bring the work of investors together to fully understand the scenarios that could play out, the future scenarios with the meat industry. And certainly there are connections to Stewart's work with, how to mitigate and best manage and mitigate and de-risk those supply chains. And so,
and I would add, Christy, that it's, these are useful. We produce our tools for investors, but we're happy to, engage companies in these discussions as well, as I'm sure Stewart is, happy to engage investors on the work that he's doing with companies. So again, I think there's a lot of overlap and synergy that all of our different organizations can bring to this discussion.
Absolutely, absolutely. And on that same topic, so this next question is for both Kevin and Stewart, and certainly Maria, you can weigh in too. How does an organization best weave risk management and resiliency planning into its culture and operations? How do you kind of embed it in organizations so that they become more resilient?
I can start with that one. Christy, I think you answered the question in your question, or really the important part of it, and that it is about process and culture, right? So a company that is really sensitive to risk and really great at risk management will de facto have a great supply chain management department. And as part of that, we'll have a great supply chain risk program. And if a company doesn't have the culture and the processes and expects resilience through heroics, heroics can work now and then, but they're not repeatable. So it really is about a culture and a process that supports a risk perspective. And I think Colgate-Palmolive, which was ranked number 2 in Gartner's 25 SCM North American programs in 2020, number 1 in 2019, I think is an example or has several practices that are exemplars of a company that really has shifted its supply chain management program to look more into the future towards climate risk. So they did a study, for example, of their mint supply chain. They found that it primarily came from North America and India. And when looking at the climate risk associated with those two growing regions, they did see problems in the future. And so they have chosen for several of their ingredients to change their strategic planning frame from 5 years to 20 years. Another thing that Colgate-Palmolive, one of the reasons why they were ranked so high in the SCM rankings, and I see this with other companies, for example, like Intel, they have really modernized and optimized their logistics operations through things like sharing truckloads in order to optimize, truckload efficiency, optimizing routes, decarbonizing their fleet. And these are exactly the type of steps that you need for an adaptive and responsive logistics chain. So even though these are introducing operational efficiencies in the day-to-day operations, they also are exactly the type of information infrastructure that you need to be more adaptive when a disruption does occur. And third, they have indeed incorporated climate change as part of their annual risk management process. And for all of their ingredients, they've identified, alternative growing regions and supplies. In general, you don't want to try to develop a new supplier relationship when a crisis occurs. There's no time. You have to involve lawyers, set up contracts. You have to develop relationships. And so both the social component and the legal component of those contingency relationships really should be thought of ahead of time and put into place, just in case.
So really it's about planning and really knowing your risks and embedding that in your culture. And I feel like both Stewart and Maria, the work that they do through their respective organizations can help companies understand that risk through the programs and tools that they've developed. And so Stewart, I don't know if you have anything to add, and Maria too, to this question of how you embed this in companies and organizations.
Maybe just a couple of points. I think Kevin's comments were spot on. I guess the good news is that there are more tools now to accomplish this than probably ever before. So I would start at the top and say, in our experience, a good governance framework is essential. And if you have from the board on down incorporating climate and environmental risk into their considerations of the business at large via the TCFD or what have you, it creates a positive cascading effect and accomplishes the perspective that Kevin was referencing. In our practical experience, getting into the weeds, so to speak, with companies on these challenges, oftentimes the solutions are in there. Risks may seem to be profound, but oftentimes they're economical and environmentally beneficial ways to tackle them. So defining that problem through research and analysis and on the ground work is important. And I would say, if we're talking about a culture of risk, if we're talking about really a broad scale adoption of this perspective, it would be helpful to help set a price. The more, companies' DNA is markets, price, et cetera, most of them at least. The more we can translate climate and environmental risk, environmental assets into economics, the better off we'll be. So if we're looking to really propagate this, companies leaning in to help establish markets and price discovery for these things would be really important.
Yeah, that's like a really excellent point, and one we struggle with, I think, when we start talking about the fair price of meat, right? I think resilience is an easy word and perhaps an overused word in post-COVID COVID days. I mean, we used it at FAIRR, so don't get me wrong. But I think when push came to shove and we were being asked, well, how do you create a resilient protein supply chain? Frankly, we at FAIRR thought we were doing the right work in order to help establish what good, strong supply chains should look like by establishing assessment frameworks and assessing risk in the meat supply chain. And I guess what we found, and I think pretty much everyone found, so again, in the face of global crisis, the word resilience, you can toss it out there, but the companies we would have thought were resilient, who had been performing well against our criteria, also weren't very resilient, and so I think this has been a challenge and will be a challenge that will have to be collaborative in terms of how we, as investors, support companies in the discussion around what resilience actually means sector by sector. So I don't even think it's something that we can toss directly on companies and say, okay, you tell us now if this comes around again, what are you going to do? I think, all the stakeholders involved here are going to have to figure out, again, maybe focusing on the essential sectors, as Kevin mentioned, how are we going to make these sectors resilient? And how are we going to get buy-in from governments, which I think is important, instead of, working against the market perhaps, and to provide these essential products that we need in a time of crisis. We actually need them to be involved in how do we support these systems, both from a company and an investor perspective, which again will support capital markets economies and the surrounding communities. So I mean, there's so much to talk about there, but I'll stop there.
It's really great insights from all of you. So really, making sure that we bring that financial aspect to essentially creating a value for nature services. And again, bringing that financial piece to this so that we can bring in the economics, because that is how businesses are run. And so whether that's the finance from the financing perspective and the investor perspective, or whether that's from the internal business perspective, that's what I'm hearing you all say, is really key. And then, of course, getting governments on board as collaborators and to facilitate some of the enforcement changes that need to happen on the ground.
Yeah, and they need to incentivize, in the right direction to make more resilient supply chains. And I think, it means maybe thinking a little bit outside of the box, particularly when we think about things like deforestation, right? There's farmers' livelihoods we have to think about. So how can we address that issue that is equitable for everyone to move these issues forward?
Thank you. And my next question is for Maria. So back to the investor perspective, how do investors participating in FAIRR gain better climate resiliency and de-risk investments in such a high-risk sector?
Again, we're constantly striving to make sure that we try to quantify these risks. So again, the climate risk tools aim really is to say, in best case and worst case scenarios, what will the impact be on companies' earnings in 2050 if we see no movement in terms of climate mitigation, or if we see a progressive response? So that's one potential way that they can sort of gain some insight in where the risks may lie. And again, in order to really instigate some dialogue in the sector. Another way that investors can get involved, and this isn't just with FAIRR, and it's with other organizations as well, is using their influence as active stewards of capital. So it's sort of our second approach that we have at FAIRR. So while we might be producing data and research and tools, we also facilitate collaborative investor engagements, and those are thematic in nature. And we have 2 engagements that we're running right now that specifically focus on supply chain resilience in climate. So one is something called Diversifying Protein Supply Chains, which looks at how global manufacturers and retailers are looking at their product portfolios and their exposure to animal protein, and how they might be able to diversify those and make those supply chains more resilient to meet climate goals that they may have internally and for the sector to stay competitive and ahead of the game. And we also have an engagement which is a collaborative dialogue with investors and companies in the global fast food sector, specifically focusing on climate risk and meat and dairy supply chains, where we're asking these global fast food giants how they are looking at their supply chains and the environmental impacts, and asking them to develop supply chain policies around that risk. And then we're also asking them to set quantitative time-bound targets to reduce the impacts of their animal proteins in their supply chain. And so, at FAIRR, I think we try to offer a suite of products and tools so that investors can say, actually, this is how I want to focus, or our stewardship team is interested. They want to focus on the theme and and de-risking their portfolio through active engagement. Or we need some more data from our credit, our credit analysts are lacking data on emerging markets, meat companies. How can FAIRR provide data and analysis to help them think better about the risk and begin to de-risk their portfolio based on data provided by the market? So we try from both perspectives, and we hope that investors will use FAIRR as one of the many tools available to have them understand the risks associated with climate.
And lastly, Stewart, I wanted to ask you, how can companies leverage NGO partners like the Nature Conservancy to create climate-proof supply chains?
Well, I think we bring a handful of different assets to the table. The first is science. We're most NGOs, and certainly as TNC, are science-based organizations. We're not a campaigning group. We're a land conservancy and conservation organization. So we have the ability to bring in the credible science that can help build programs, build policies in a way that really has the highest potential for having good environmental benefits integrated into business cases. The second is really a network, and I think really in an increasing way, a financial network is important. TNC has an impact investing arm. We are active in the venture capital space with partners. We obviously have connections to foundations and to multilateral funding sources, many of which are starting to look at the private sector interventions as ways to unlock scale. So there's co-funding and a variety of different partnership opportunities in that space that NGOs can bring. And I guess the last two would be, we work on the ground. We have people in places that businesses care about, but they probably didn't realize they care about until they start asking these questions, but yet we're there. And I think the last point would be patience. We're in these places and have been for a long time, and the cycle of our vision is generally a little bit longer than many businesses. So we have the kind of patience, patient capital to go and solve some of these sticky problems. So I would say it's those four things.
Thank you. For all of you, I just think this has been such a valuable discussion to highlight not only the work that you're doing, but the great work that's going on in supply chains and the collaborations that are happening with investors and businesses and local communities to help really create the resilient supply chains that we need going forward with the impacts that we're already seeing from climate change. And so I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank you for the work that you do, Kevin, Marie, and Stewart. And I also want to thank our participants for being with us today and for joining us. And we hope that you have learned something about supply chain resiliency and have gotten inspired to keep up the good work that you're doing in whatever you endeavor. So thank you all very much and have a good day.
Thanks, Christy. Appreciate the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.